The hyena travelled at the hour when heat loosened its grip but didn't let go. The sky was still the colour of tin. The last light slid low across the flats and turned the salt into something almost clean, white in the distance, bruised grey closer in, pocked and cracked where old water had dried and new water had never returned. Spotted hyenas were not desert animals in the way people imagined desert animals. They preferred places that offered cover, prey, conflict, edges, not emptiness. But drought pushed the borders of life outward. When the grasslands browned and the herds broke into smaller pieces, the hyena learned new routes, followed new smells. This female was leaner than she'd been a month ago. Her ribs didn't show yet, but the softness along her flanks had tightened. She moved with the rolling, economical gait of a creature that had spent most of its life walking and waiting. Her ears were upright, turning as if they were listening to different conversations at once. She crossed a hard-packed path that cut like a scar through the scrub. The salt track. Humans had made it without naming it. It was the route used by donkey carts and motorbikes and bare feet, the line between a cluster of villages and the salt pans where people worked when the rains failed. It was also the route used by cattle, thin cattle, this year when their owners walked them towards salty springs and mineral licks, hoping for strength where grass could not give it. The salt track smelled of many things: dust, sweat, oil from engines, donkey dung. And underneath that, something older and stranger. The faint cold bite of salt carried on the wind as if the earth itself had been cut open. The hyena slowed when she reached the track. Not because she was afraid of the path. Paths were useful, but paths belonged to people, and people brought risks that didn't show up in the wind until it was too late. She stepped onto the track and padded across it, claws clicking softly on the hardened ground. Halfway over, she stopped. Her head dipped. Her nose moved. Her eyes narrowed. A smell had lifted from the wind that didn't belong to this place. Meat, yes, but not fresh kill. Not the sharp iron of blood. Something else. Fat warmed by sun. Meat that had been handled, carried. Human food. She stood very still, letting her ears do the work. Somewhere to the east, beyond a low rise where thorn bushes grew like wire, a vehicle rattled over stones. The sound was distant but distinct. An engine not running smoothly, a loose panel clapping. A motorcycle, maybe. She waited until the sound faded, then continued. Hyenas were often described as scavengers in the lazy way people used words when they didn't want to think too hard. In reality, a hyena was a specialist in opportunity. She hunted when it made sense. She stole when it was safer. She watched other animals like a reader watches a page, looking for the moment the story turned. The salt pans were not a natural hunting ground, but they were full of stories that turned. At the edge of the flats, where scrubland stopped and white ground began, a man named Juma stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the sky as if he could bargain with it. Juma was not old, but work had written itself into him early. Thin scars on his shins, calluses on his palms, the quiet impatience of someone who had learned that waiting did not always bring answers. He wore rubber boots dusted white with salt and a shirt whose sleeves had been cut off long ago. Behind him, a group of workers moved in slow, practiced rhythms across the pan. Some scraped crusted salt into piles, some shoveled it into sacks. Others carried the sacks to a battered truck parked on firmer ground. The salt business was never clean. It looked clean from far away, white on white, bright under sun, but up close it was harsh. Salt ate metal. It cracked skin. It turned every cut into a lesson. This year, it was worse. The pans had been expanding as drought tightened. People dug where they hadn't dug before. They followed the salt crust out farther, chasing the last places where brine still rose from underground seams. The old pits were played out, and the new pits were dangerous. 2 days earlier, a boy named Nuru had stepped onto what looked like solid crust and dropped through to his chest. They hauled him out by his arms, his legs kicking in panic, brine-soaked and shaking. He was alive, but his face carried a new kind of fear. The fear of ground that could turn into water without warning. Juma watched the newer pits carefully now. He didn't say much about it. He didn't want to scare people who had to work anyway, but he had started keeping count of which areas sounded hollow when you struck them with a shovel, because some places echoed wrong. A second person stood near the truck, marking things on a clipboard protected by a plastic bag. Her name was Dr. Lena Okiki. She was a geologist contracted by a regional water authority, the kind of person invited into difficult places because her work was useful, then resented because her work could also shut things down. She wore field trousers and a wide-brimmed hat, and her boots were new enough to look out of place. But her eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent years watching landscapes for small betrayals, cracks that widened, soil that slumped, salt crust that buckled. Lena had come because a borehole drilled near the villages had turned salty overnight, poisoning a well that had always been sweet. The elders blamed many things: bad luck, spirits, upstream theft, a curse brought by outsiders. The water authority blamed hydrological changes. Lena blamed the simplest answer that fit the facts. Someone had opened a pathway between the brine and the fresh water. Digging did that. So did old mines. So did sinkholes. And the salt pans were full of both history and holes. She watched a worker strike the crust with a shovel. The sound was crisp. Good. She watched him strike again, farther out, near a place where the salt looked slightly different. Less bright, more grey. The sound there was wrong. Not dull, not hollow in a simple way, but wrong. A brief, tight echo that suggested a cavity underneath, like tapping a drum skin stretched over empty air. Lena's pen paused. Juma noticed. He walked over and looked at the spot without stepping too close. "You hear it," he said. Lena nodded. "How long has it sounded like that?" Juma's mouth tightened. "This season, when we started digging farther. Any collapses?" "Not yet," Juma said, then corrected himself. "Small ones. Crust breaks. A man goes down to his knee, but not big." Lena looked toward the horizon. Beyond the pans, heat shimmered faintly. Somewhere past that shimmer lay a dry riverbed, then a line of acacia, then the villages. "If it collapses big," Lena said, "it will be fast." Juma's gaze sharpened. "We know fast." "I mean faster than you can run," Lena said quietly. Juma didn't answer. He stared at the grey patch of crust as if staring could make it solid. The hyena arrived after dusk. She did not walk directly onto the flats. She followed the scrub line, moving from shadow to shadow, stopping often to listen. The air carried salt and sweat and something else, the sharp odour of fear from animals penned too close to human work. A small goat pen sat near the edge of the pans, made of thorn branches and tied wire. The goats inside bleated softly, restless. Their eyes reflected dim light like coins. The hyena's head turned. Goats were easy, compared to most wild prey, but goats came with men who threw stones, with dogs, with shouted warnings. Goats were the kind of meal that could cost you a broken tooth or a torn ear if you were careless. She circled downwind. Near the truck, workers had built a small fire. A pot steamed. Voices rose and fell. Someone laughed briefly, the laugh of exhaustion more than joy. The hyena watched from behind a thorn bush. Then she saw it, a sack of something set apart from the others, tied loosely, not stacked, food, maybe, or supplies, left close to the truck so it wouldn't be stolen. A smell drifted from it, dried fish, perhaps, or meat. The hyena lowered her body and moved. Her paws made almost no sound on the packed ground. She crossed the last stretch of scrub and stepped onto the crusted edge of the pan where the salt was hard enough to hold. She padded forward, eyes fixed on the sack. Then she stopped, because the ground under her feet gave a sound that did not match her weight. It wasn't the crunch of crust or the squeak of dry salt. It was a faint, thin booming, a muted echo that travelled through her bones. The ground echoed wrong. The hyena's ears flicked back. She shifted her weight, testing. Another step, the same wrong sound, as if she was walking on the roof of something hollow. She froze, muscles tight, instincts arguing. Predators took risks, but they did not gamble blindly. They survived by choosing which dangers were worth it. The smell from the sack was tempting, but the sound under her paws was new, unfamiliar, dangerous in a way teeth were not. She backed up, step by careful step, until the sound changed back into normal crust. She stood there in the dark, looking toward the truck, and she made a decision. She would not cross that hollow patch again, not tonight. Instead, she turned her attention to the edges, where human carelessness often left small gifts. Scraps thrown away, bones dropped, a spilled container of something salty and fat. She moved along the perimeter, nose low, scanning for an opening. And in the distance, near the grey patch of crust Lena had marked, the salt pan gave a faint settling groan that no one heard over the crackle of the fire. Except the hyena. Her head snapped up. The ground didn't just echo wrong, it spoke wrong. Morning came sharp and bright, as if the sky had been scrubbed clean overnight. The salt pans glittered under sunlight. The crust looked strong from a distance, almost beautiful. People who had never worked here sometimes took photographs and said words like snow and mirror, not understanding that the beauty was a kind of trick. The hyena watched from a low ridge beyond the scrub. In daylight she was harder to be, because daylight belonged to humans. But hunger didn't care about ownership. Hunger simply counted hours. She had not eaten enough in 2 days. She had found scraps, yes, a fish spine, a piece of stale bread tossed near the fire, a chicken bone so clean it was barely worth chewing. But the kind of food that filled her needed either a kill or a theft big enough to matter. Her clan was not here. The nearest den site lay farther inland, near a seasonal river that had not flowed properly in years. She had left the clan's range because competition had become too expensive, too many mouths, too few carcasses. She was living on the edge, alone, which was not normal for a hyena, but it happened during hard seasons. She watched the salt track as people arrived. Donkey carts creaked in, their wheels powdered white. A motorbike came with 2 men, sacks tied behind the seat. A group of women walked with buckets balanced on their heads, faces wrapped against sun and salt dust. And then, near mid-morning, a herd of cattle appeared on the track, thin, ribs like ladder rungs, horns drooping. They were guided by 2 boys and an older man with a stick. The cattle walked toward the mineral lick at the far edge of the pan, where brine seeped and dried into a crust that animals craved. The hyena's mouth filled with saliva. Cattle were too big for her alone, but calves, weakened adults, any animal that stumbled, those were possibilities. And where cattle went, so did afterbirth, dung, the faint smell of sickness. Hyenas could read that like a letter. She stood and began to move parallel to the herd, keeping to scrub, staying downwind. Lena had returned with better instruments. She had spent the night in the village, listening to elders argue in a language she understood only partly, catching the tone even when she missed the words. Distrust, fear, fatigue. People wanted answers. People wanted permission to continue working without thinking about the ground beneath them. The water authority wanted a report that could justify either new drilling or a shutdown of dangerous digging. The salt workers wanted neither. They wanted the pans to remain open and the authorities to stay away. Lena arrived that morning with a handheld ground-penetrating radar unit and a small sledgehammer. Juma met her near the edge of the grey patch of crust. His eyes looked tired. "We worked there," he said, nodding toward the newer pits. "We stayed away from the spot you marked, but we worked close." Lena's mouth tightened. "Why?" Juma shrugged in a way that was not casual but forced. "Because salt does not wait. Buyers don't wait. Children don't wait." Lena nodded once, acknowledging the truth without approving it. "I need to scan," she said. "No one steps on that area until I'm done." Juma gestured for his crew to stay back. Lena walked the radar unit slowly across the crust, eyes on the screen, watching shapes form and dissolve like ghost images. The signal returned unevenly, interrupted by salt density changes, but a pattern emerged. There were cavities, not small pockets, not cracks, larger spaces, voids beneath the crust, some connected like tunnels. It looked like the honeycombed aftermath of brine withdrawal, like the earth had been eaten from below. Lena swallowed. This wasn't just a risk to workers, it was a risk to the villages. If a collapse changed groundwater flow, brine could surge into freshwater layers. If a cavity connected to an old natural channel, it could suddenly open, swallowing surface into the underworld of salt. She took the sledgehammer and tapped the crust gently. The sound that returned was the same wrong echo the hyena had heard. Thin, sharp, too resonant for solid ground. Lena turned to Juma. "This area," she said, "must be closed." Juma's face hardened. "Closed means no work." "Closed means no deaths," Lena said. Juma's jaw flexed. He didn't look away. "You will tell them," he said, and his voice made it clear what he meant. "You will tell the families who have no other income." Lena felt the heat on her neck and the salt glare in her eyes. She wanted to say something clean and simple. "I'm sorry, but sorry didn't build wells or feed children." She glanced toward the salt track and saw the cattle herd moving toward the lick, guided by boys who didn't understand this kind of danger either. The pans were filling with life at the exact moment Lena realized the ground might not hold any of it. The collapse began with a sound that was almost nothing. Not a roar, not a crack like ice breaking, but a soft whoomp, the sound of air shifting in a space that should not exist. The hyena heard it first. She was moving through scrub, parallel to the cattle, when the ground made that muted boom again, deeper this time, as if something below had exhaled. Her head lifted. Her ears went forward so hard they looked sharpened. The cattle reacted a second later, nervous energy rippling through them. A few tossed their heads. One stepped sideways, hooves clacking. The boys yelled and waved their sticks, trying to keep them moving. The older man guiding them stopped and looked toward the pans. People did that too, paused, listening, not sure what they'd heard, but sure they'd heard something. On the salt flat, near the grey patch Lena had marked, a thin line appeared in the crust. It looked like a crack in dried paint. Then it widened. The surface sagged in a slow, impossible way. Salt crust that had held trucks and carts bent like paper over water. Lena shouted, her voice cutting through the air. "Back! Everyone back!" Juma turned and began waving his arms, yelling to his crew. Workers hesitated, confused. Then the crust dropped. It didn't break in one piece. It folded and tore, collapsing into itself. The white surface fell into a cavity with a rushing sound like a sudden wind. A cloud of fine salt dust puffed upward, blooming into sunlight, turning the air bright and choking. Two men near the edge stumbled. One caught himself and scrambled back, eyes wide. The other slipped, his boots sliding on loose crust. Juma lunged. He grabbed the man's wrist with both hands and pulled, muscles straining. The man kicked for purchase, heels scraping salt, his face twisted in panic. The edge crumbled. For a second, it looked like both of them would go. Then Jonah, who had arrived that morning with the cattle herd's older guide, hired as extra security and support because he was known for being steady in emergencies, ran forward with a coil of rope in his hands. He threw the rope in a quick, practiced motion. Juma caught it without thinking, looped it around his forearm, and Jonah braced himself by dropping his weight low. The man at the edge scrambled, clawing, and Juma and Jonah hauled him back. They fell together onto safer crust, panting, salt dust coating their faces like powder. The collapse continued, widening outward in a jagged oval. Buckets, shovels, a few sacks of salt slid into the hole and vanished. The sound from below was a hollow roar, as if the earth was swallowing in gulps. People backed away, coughing, shouting, eyes watering. Lena stood on firmer ground, heart pounding. She had known it could happen. She had not known it would happen today with so many people so close. Juma spit salt dust and stared at the hole. "What is under there?" he rasped. Lena stared too, feeling the wrongness in her stomach. "A void," she said. "A cavity, maybe many." Brine took the support away. Digging made it worse. Juma looked at her as if he wanted to blame her for being right. Then a new sound cut across the chaos, the sharp, frightened bleat of a goat. The goat pen near the edge had been shaken by the tremor. One side of the thorn fence sagged. Goats pressed against it, trying to escape. A small kid slipped through a gap and bolted toward the scrub, and the hyena, watching from the ridge, saw it. Hunger made decisions fast. She broke into a run. The kid goat ran with the frantic speed of something that had never been chased properly before. It darted between thorn bushes, hooves slipping in dust. It bleated again, high and thin. The hyena closed the distance quickly, shoulders low, head steady. She was built for endurance, but she could accelerate when opportunity demanded it. A shout rose from behind. One of the women had seen the escape, had seen the hyena's shape cutting through brush. Jonah heard too. He turned, eyes scanning, and spotted the movement. The spotted body, the stiff mane, the purposeful line of pursuit. He reacted without thinking in words. He ran. Jonah was fast, but he had a human's limits. He didn't try to outrun the hyena, he tried to cut her angle. He sprinted toward the scrub, shouting, clapping, making himself big. He grabbed a stick from the ground and waved it. The hyena flicked her ears back at the noise, but did not stop. The goat kid was close now, too close to ignore. Jonah lunged forward and threw a handful of salt-dusty sand. It hit the hyena's face, fine grains stinging eyes and nose. She flinched hard, head snapping sideways. The goat kid veered and crashed into a bush, tangled for half a second. Jonah reached the kid first. He scooped it up awkwardly, the animal kicking and bleating, and turned back toward the pan, toward people. The hyena recovered, blinking, her lips drawn back, not in a cartoon snarl, but in the tense display of a predator frustrated at the last moment. She took 2 steps forward, then she stopped. Because the ground beneath Jonah, near the edge of the pan, gave that wrong echo again as he ran. Jonah felt it too. Not as a sound exactly, but as a vibration through his feet. He slowed instinctively, shifting to firmer ground, moving away from the areas where the salt crust looked slightly darker, slightly thinner. The hyena watched him do it, and something in her posture changed. She lowered her head and looked not at Jonah, not at the goat kid, but at the ground, the surface, the edges, the patterns of crack and crust. She understood something simple and crucial. This place did not hold, and if it did not hold for a man with 2 legs and a goat in his arms, it would not hold for her either. The hunger in her stomach argued, but the instinct to avoid invisible danger was older and louder. She backed away slowly into scrub, keeping her eyes on Jonah until the brush swallowed her shape. Later, when the dust settled and the workers had pulled themselves together, the hole remained like a wound in the salt pan. It was wider now, the edges slumped, the interior shadowed. Salt crust had collapsed into layers, revealing darker wet patches beneath. A faint briny smell rose from it, like an open mouth. Juma stood with Lena and Jonah near the boundary Lena had marked, now made obvious by disaster. Juma's face was stiff. "If we close," he said, voice low, "we starve." Lena stared at the hole. "If you don't close," she said, "someone dies, and the well water will turn. Then you starve anyway." Jonah shifted the rescued goat kid to the arms of its owner, a young woman whose eyes were still wide with adrenaline. She thanked him softly, then walked away, clutching the animal to her chest. Juma watched her go. Then he looked back at Lena. "What do we do?" Lena let out a breath. "We move," she said. "We stop digging here. We find safer ground. We test. We dig wells that don't intersect brine. We—" Juma laughed once, bitterly. "We," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Who is we?" Lena didn't have a clean answer. Not one that could fill a belly. Not one that could fix a season. She looked across the flats, where the salt glittered and hid its weakness, and she understood why animals survived here better than humans sometimes did. Animals listened to the ground and moved when it lied. Humans argued with the ground until it proved itself. As evening came again and the heat loosened, the hyena returned to the ridge. She did not come closer to the pans. She did not cut the salt track again. She watched from distance as people gathered, talking in tight circles, pointing at the hole, voices sharp with fear and blame. She listened to the hollow quiet that followed. The ground did not echo now, because nothing stepped where it was weak. But the hyena remembered the wrong sound. She turned away and trotted into the scrub, following a different line, one that led toward a dry riverbed where old carcasses sometimes lay, where vultures sometimes circled, where the ground was ordinary enough to trust. Behind her, the salt pan glittered in the last light like a promise. And in its center, the hole waited, silent proof that some paths, once cut, never become safe again.